Charles Fraser. Time which heals no wounds. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 6. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production. I sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping my arms around myself. Completely foreign yet so familiar, I looked around my new old room, as I did every morning. Holmes was still asleep at this hour, but as soon as the first ray of sunlight dared to venture through the window in the early morning, I was already sitting bolt upright on the edge of my bed. Not that I had been sleeping before then. Oh no, sleep had been almost unthinkable these past weeks. Since my friend Holmes took me home from that murderous nursing home and rescued me from my lethargy and the dark swamp of my thoughts, I have been actively participating in life again. People no longer consider me demented or even mentally ill, yet I struggle daily, and especially at night, with my demons. They pursue me, they hold me tight, they grip me and barely leave me enough air to breathe. I see them clearly before me. My Caroline, lying there stretched out, her eyes wide open. It still seems to me as if she's looking straight at me. Her face was grotesquely distorted, yet her silky, long blonde hair framed it like a halo. I close my eyes and picture her. Her enchanting smile, her radiant blue eyes, the way she winks at me mischievously. But suddenly her expression changes. Her features become fearful, indeed almost panic-stricken. I startle. There it is again, the bloody bullet hole in the middle of her forehead. She lies in her pool of blood. Her silken blonde hair is already stained red at the tips. I kneel down beside her, take hold of her ice-cold hand and press it against my cheek. Her fingers are stiff. These fingers no longer caress my face as they had done countless times before with such tenderness. Then everything goes black around me and I collapse. That was the last time I saw my Caroline, felt her and touched her, even though it was only her lifeless body. I cried out in pain. I shook my head trying to rid myself of these images, when suddenly I felt a warm, bony hand on my shoulder. It was Holmes, who, with his firm grip, brought me back to the here and now and made the images disappear. There, old friend," he said soothingly. "Everything is all right. You're home." "I'm fine," I protested. "It's just—" "You don't need to say anything. I can well imagine that the ghosts are tormenting you." I said nothing, but merely nodded in agreement. "Have you actually visited Caroline's grave since you've been, let's put it charmingly, back in the area?" "No," I said, with a brief smile at Holmes's carefully chosen words. "Well then, what are we waiting for? Even if your ghosts haven't fallen completely silent yet, they will at least become quieter and more bearable. Trust me." Before we could set off, Holmes insisted on a small breakfast, which Alice had lovingly prepared for us. So there we sat, facing each other at the small table. While Holmes absent-mindedly leafed through his newspaper and took pleasurable bites of his toast, I stared around the room without appetite. Strange, our flat looked exactly the same as it did when I first moved in half a lifetime ago. The living room, where we were having our breakfast, had the same nondescript wall colour, and the floor appeared to be the same as well. No, wait, I could remember that the floor in the back corner of the room had a black burn mark back then. One of Holmes's experiments had gone awry again and finally exploded when it hit the floor. I could remember exactly how I hurriedly armed myself with a bucket and rushed to the bathroom to fetch water. I cursed like a sailor and lamented the good floor, while Holmes was as pleased as Punch because he finally knew what had caused it and could fix the error. "Watson, you're not eating anything at all." Holmes gave me one of his reproachful looks. I never would have thought that our roles would one day be reversed. I remember all too well how you practically tried to force me to eat back then. "You mean when you preferred to start the day completely drugged up, rather than having a proper breakfast?" "Quite right. Oh, how I miss that most effective substance from the good old days. I must say, I'm rather pleased that you've become a tad more sensible in your old age," I observed. "I wouldn't necessarily call it sensible," said Holmes. Rather, the fact that as one becomes increasingly elderly, one simply no longer has the opportunity to purchase truly good stuff. While I am supplied by young Billy, you know, my paper boy, but compared to my usual high-dosage merchandise from the old days, this stuff is more suited to a children's party. Don't let dear Alice hear that, I said. I'm quite certain she wouldn't exactly share your opinion. Holmes laughed, put down his napkin, pushed back his chair and stood up. Come, my friend, let us depart and get this over with. Hesitantly, I entered Highgate Cemetery in Camden. I could feel my wobbly knees and my sweating hands. Holmes led me purposefully to Caroline's grave. How do you know so precisely where her grave is? I asked Holmes. He replied pragmatically. Since I couldn't officially attend your funeral, I took the liberty of visiting your wife's grave to mourn you. Holmes merely shrugged his shoulders briefly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Sometimes I simply could not understand my friend. And by that, I don't mean his razor-sharp intellect, no. Rather, I'm referring to his sometimes peculiar and stubborn nature. Accordingly, I answered him angrily. And when you stood at my wife's grave mourning me, did it not occur to you that I was still alive, and you could have simply visited me in the nursing home? I snorted with rage. No. Instead, you preferred to let me languish for 4 long years whilst feeling sorry for yourself. Holmes gave me one of his peculiar looks and replied, Now, who's getting all worked up? You're here now, and I'm doing my best to make amends for my mistake. Sherlock Holmes has admitted to making a mistake. Well, I never. When I finally stood before my beloved Caroline's grave, my anger towards Holmes dissipated just as quickly as it had come. I knelt down, very slowly and carefully, so as not to overtax my old bones, plagued by arthritis. Hesitantly, I placed my flat hand on the burial mound and told Caroline all those things I had been unable to tell her back then. Finally, I laid my white lily, Caroline's favourite flower, on her grave. Holmes helped me get back on my feet, placed a sympathetic hand on my shoulder and said, Are you feeling better now, Watson? I gazed firmly at Caroline's final resting place. Yes, for now I also know what must be done. Holmes, you have a case. Find my wife's murderer. Holmes said nothing for a long while, then took a step towards me and spoke. Watson, there is no case. Caroline committed suicide. Suicide? I couldn't believe it. Holmes, that cannot be. I saw her. Night after night I see her lying there on the floor with the hole in her forehead. Agitatedly, I began pacing back and forth. Watson, do stand still and listen to me. My friend tried to calm me down. I can remember precisely when Inspector Lestrade came to Baker Street 4 years ago and delivered the dreadful news. He most certainly spoke of suicide, however difficult that may be for you to comprehend. Holmes approached me, but I waved him off. Holmes, now you listen to me. It wasn't suicide. I know that for certain. And don't you dare come at me with you need to rest, Watson. The last few weeks have been very taxing, Watson. You've been through a lot, Watson. I know what I saw, and it most certainly was not suicide. Very well, said Holmes soothingly. Then let's go through the whole thing step by step. Tell me exactly what you believe you remember. You know, Watson, even the smallest detail could be important. I took 2 deep breaths and summoned up the dreadful images again. She was lying on the floor, framed by her own blood. Her eyes were wide open with terror. I shook my head in despair. Where was the murder weapon? Holmes wanted to know. What murder weapon? I asked, bewildered. Well, the weapon Caroline used to shoot herself. Holmes, you don't need to explain to me what a murder weapon is, I replied irritably. Well, that's good then. So where was the weapon? There wasn't one. Watson, think about it. Where was the pistol? I told you there wasn't any weapon, I shouted at Holmes. Watson, Holmes began again. Lestrade told me at the time that Caroline had shot herself with a Beretta 418. This weapon was found lying next to your wife and was clearly identified as the murder weapon. Lestrade even asked me if I knew where Caroline had obtained this weapon from. That cannot be, I cried indignantly. I am absolutely certain that I did not see any weapon. Very well. Holmes thoughtfully stroked his chin. What would you say to paying Inspector Lestrade a visit? A short while later, Holmes and I were sitting in Inspector Lestrade's living room, drinking tea. Lestrade, who was eyeing me critically, set his cup aside and said, I am truly delighted to have you both as my guests, but let's get to the point. How may I be of assistance? Holmes wasted no time and spoke up. Inspector Lestrade, do you recall the case of Caroline Watson? You mean the suicide? Of course I remember. How could I not? Holmes shot me a brief glance that reflected our deep familiarity and made it unmistakably clear that I should raise no objections and remain quiet. That's exactly the one I mean, Inspector, said Holmes. But please, Inspector, tell me once again exactly what you remember. How you found Caroline Watson. Describe the crime scene. You know what I mean. Inspector Lestrade seemed to ponder how best to begin, but then found the right words and directed his gaze at me. My dear Dr. Watson, first I would like to express once again my deepest sympathies for the loss of your beloved wife. He cleared his throat briefly, then continued. It was on a Friday evening. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. We were called by your neighbour, Miss Spanton. When we arrived at your home, Caroline Watson was lying dead in the hallway. You, Dr. Watson, were unconscious on top of her. At first, I feared the worst and thought you were dead too. But I quickly realised that your heart was beating, you had sustained no injuries, and you must have merely fainted. You were given initial treatment by the arriving doctor and taken away. As for your wife, we could quite obviously only confirm her death. The bullet hole in the middle of her forehead was unmistakable. We quickly came to the conclusion that your wife must have taken her own life. The weapon had fallen from her hand, but was within immediate reach. The weapon was also positively identified as the murder weapon. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My Caroline was supposed to have killed herself? But Holmes's voice quickly snapped me out of my thoughts. Inspector Lestrade, is there any possibility of obtaining a police report regarding Caroline Watson's suicide? You're in luck, Mr. Holmes. Normally, when a case is classified as suicide and considered closed, the file is usually transferred to the main archives. However, in this particular case, since the matter affected me quite personally, I kept a copy with my personal records. Just a moment, please. Inspector Lestrade rose hastily and left the room for a moment, only to return shortly after with the file under his arm. Wordlessly, he handed it to Holmes. Would you be so kind as to lend me the file on Caroline Watson for a few days? Holmes asked Inspector Lestrade. But of course, Mr. Holmes, for as long as you need it. After that, we exchanged a few pleasantries before Holmes and I bid farewell to Inspector Lestrade and returned to Baker Street. Completely exhausted from the day's impressions, I collapsed into the comfortable armchair and took a deep breath. Holmes, on the other hand, had already buried his nose in Caroline's file. Have you managed to discover anything interesting yet? Indeed, my dear friend. I'm slowly beginning to think you're right and your wife was truly murdered. My heart began to beat faster. You believe me? I took you at your word from the very beginning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have needed to visit Inspector Lestrade in the first place, Holmes replied laconically. However, Holmes did not speak further and left me groping in the dark. How it irritated me to have to virtually drag every little detail out of him. May I ask what you found in the file that makes you believe me? You may, Watson. The crime scene description states that the murder weapon was found approximately 20 centimetres below Caroline's outstretched arm. Nothing unusual in itself, if it weren't for the fact that your wife was right-handed and the weapon was found on her left side. What's more puzzling to me is why your wife would shoot herself with a Beretta 418 when she could have just as easily used your Webley revolver. Where did your wife get this weapon from? And why would she acquire a weapon at all when there was already one in the household? Holmes's astuteness never ceased to amaze me after all these years, and I felt increasingly relieved that he believed me. What shall we do now? I asked him impatiently. The best course of action would be to take a closer look around your home. Perhaps we'll stumble upon further evidence and make some progress. But Holmes, how could that be possible? My house was sold when they thought I was senile and put me in the nursing home. I don't think the new owner has left everything as it was, and I doubt he'd be delighted if we asked to turn the house upside down. "Oh, I rather think so," said Holmes. "You're mad," I replied to him. "I'm afraid I must disagree with you. I bought your house and everything has remained exactly as it was. We will need to air it out properly, and I insist that from now on I be allowed to smoke in your house, but otherwise there should be nothing standing in the way of a thorough search for clues." I shook my head, deeply moved. I could hardly believe it. "Why did you do that? Buy the house, I mean." "Let's put it this way. I simply couldn't allow just anyone to buy your house and live in it." "I've never known you to be this sentimental. Are you going soft in your old age?" I was clearly taking great pleasure in teasing my friend. Besides, I was infinitely grateful to him. I held the doorknob for quite a while before daring to press it down and enter my former home, where I once lived in happier days with my dear wife. A wave of memories and emotions washed over me. I briefly leaned against the wall in the hallway to avoid losing my balance and falling over. She had lain right there in front of me. It was exactly here that I saw her for the last time, and at that moment my entire world fell apart. "Do you need another moment?" Holmes asked me. "No, thank you. I'm quite all right," I replied with a deliberately steady voice. "Right then, let's head to the bedroom." Holmes was about to take the stairs to the upper floor when my question caught up with him. "Why the bedroom?" "Because women always hide everything in the bedroom if there's something to hide." Holmes looked at me disapprovingly. "I thought you were the one who understood women between the two of us." I remained silent, owing Holmes an answer, and instead trudged up the stairs after him. Holmes headed towards the chest of drawers beside our marital bed. "May I?" he asked politely. I merely nodded. Then he opened the first drawer and rummaged through Caroline's things. The second and third drawers followed. No noteworthy findings, except that I had to struggle to maintain my composure as my best friend searched through my wife's underwear. "Nothing," Holmes stated emotionlessly. Then he laboriously lowered himself to the floor and peered under our bed. He even scrutinized our mattress with great care. Next came the wardrobe. He pushed aside hanger after hanger of Caroline's neatly hung garments and checked every pocket to see if anything might be concealed within. Then he got back down on his knees and examined the bottom of the wardrobe. "Here we have something," Holmes called out triumphantly. I leaned down beside him to get a better look at what he meant. And indeed, on the wardrobe floor there was a board that stood ever so slightly higher than the others. Holmes carefully tried to lift it out. He succeeded instantly. A bundle of letters came to light. Unfortunately, all of them were missing their envelopes. Only the written pages remained, tied together in a small package. Holmes untied the purple ribbon that held them together. Anxiously, I sat on the floor next to Holmes and asked myself that one question. Why would my Caroline hide a bundle of letters from me, her own husband, in the wardrobe? Holmes began to read aloud. "My 1905, my beloved Caroline, I am ashamed to have to convey this news to you by letter, but I shall marry M. I have excellent prospects of reaching the very top in my career. You surely understand that for this I need a suitable wife by my side. You know that due to your shameful past, there can be no future for us together. Yet rest assured of my love for you. I have made provisions for you and little Susie. I shall carry you in my heart forever. With love, your G.B." My mouth hung open in astonishment and disbelief. "Interesting," remarked Holmes, whilst quite different adjectives were swirling around in my head, such as inconceivable, incomprehensible, and utterly mad. Meanwhile, Holmes was thoroughly enthused and reached for the next letter. I quickly snatched the letter from his hand. "Now hold your horses," I snapped at Holmes. "I haven't even processed the first letter yet." Exasperated, Holmes snatched the letter back from me, opened it and remarked, "There's no time for your indisposition. We're on to something hot here." "What do you mean, no time?" I practically shouted. "This piece of paper has been lying forgotten in the cupboard for years." "Watson," Holmes scolded me, "do you want to solve the mystery about your wife or not?" Holmes smoothed out the sheet of paper and began anew. "My dear G, with a heavy heart but full understanding of your decision, I inform you that I fully accept your marriage to M. I will never forget everything you have done for me and will be eternally grateful. It saddens me that our little Susie must grow up without her father, but I will always tell her what a generous and helpful man her father is, and that I love him dearly. Yours, Caroline." Now I was completely at a loss. "My Caroline is supposed to have a daughter called Susie." "It certainly appears so," Holmes confirmed dryly. "By my calculations, the little miss must be at least 26 years old today. I can't make sense of any of this anymore. Caroline never mentioned having a daughter, nor any father to go with it. This is all too much for me." I buried my face in my hands. Holmes gave me a rough pat on the back and said, "Be that as it may, Caroline must have had good reasons for keeping it secret. The fact is, she loved you sincerely during your marriage. As far as I know, that's all that matters. Now chin up, old friend, you owe that much to your wife." With these words, Holmes took the next sheet of paper and began to read. "Dear Caroline, I have thought long and hard about how best to write these lines to you. I have come to the decision to take little Susie to live with me and my wife. M unfortunately cannot have children, and the little one would have a good life with us. Her well-being would be perfectly provided for, and if you're sensible, you'll realise that this decision is best for all involved. You simply don't have the financial means to properly care for Susie in the long term, and if you think about it honestly, it certainly won't benefit the little one's future to be raised by a former prostitute. I hope you understand my decision and won't resist it, as I will implement my intentions by any means necessary. I wish you a nice life. Yours, GB." "My Caroline was supposedly a prostitute. Impossible!" I cried out in horror. "Calm down, Watson. For now, let's put that allegation aside and think. Have you noticed how the wind has changed? In the first letter, this GB merely dismissed your wife, but now he's denouncing her and wants to take away their child." "Yes, that didn't escape my notice," I said angrily. "What sort of scoundrel is this GB, wanting to take a child away from its mother?" Holmes took the next letter and read aloud. "Hello, GB. I cannot believe that you are asking me to give up my most precious, my dearest possession. I thought I knew what kind of person you were, namely, one of the good ones. How thoroughly mistaken I was. I will never forgive you for this, and rest assured, I will fight for my daughter." "Caroline, that sounds like my wife," I stated. "Holmes, read the next letter. What happens next?" "That's the last one, Watson. Very well." Holmes took the final letter and I waited eagerly for its contents. "You monster! She's gone. I cannot believe you've actually taken her from me. I'm her mother. No one will ever love her as much as I do, and you just take her away from me? What kind of person are you? I hate you." "And then? Is there nothing else?" I asked impatiently. "No, that was all. Do you notice anything here, Watson?" "The letter isn't signed," I replied. "And then?" Holmes wanted to know. "Well, that this GB actually took the child away from Caroline in the end." "That's not what I mean, Watson. Think about it. The letters from your wife to this mysterious GB could never have been sent, which means he never read them. I believe your wife was merely venting her feelings through these lines." "No, Holmes, you're wrong here. Caroline had a habit of writing every letter twice and keeping the duplicate in her correspondence. I often teased her about it, but she always maintained that she wanted to know what she had written to whom and when. Each time, I would laugh and simply say, 'Whatever you say, darling.' Well, then we can probably assume that the letters did reach this GB." Holmes rose laboriously and said, "Watson, I believe we're done here for now. Let's return to Baker Street." Completely exhausted, both emotionally and physically, I gratefully accepted the glass of brandy that Holmes handed to me. I took a deep sip and enjoyed the warmth that spread through my throat. "What happens next?" I asked Holmes. Holmes crossed his legs and thoughtfully contemplated his brandy glass. "Did your wife have any living relatives we could speak to?" "No. Caroline was very young when she came to London from Germany with her parents. Her parents died in quick succession. Her mother passed away during another pregnancy, and her father had a fatal accident at work a few weeks later. Other relatives are likely still in Germany. I'm not aware of anyone here in London." "And what about long-standing friends who could tell us something about Caroline's past?" Holmes wanted to know. "No, not that I know of. She had some casual acquaintances, like our neighbour, but no deeper, long-lasting friendships. I think we'll set out tomorrow evening and make the rounds of London's brothels. Perhaps someone will remember Caroline and can tell us more about her." "But Holmes, it must be a good 30 years since Caroline last worked as a prostitute," I interjected. "I know the chances are slim, but it's worth a try. I think we should go to bed and get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long evening." As Holmes and I stood before the first brothel, I felt rather uneasy. Would we truly discover anything about Caroline here? We were greeted by a matron of about 70 who eyed us suspiciously. "Good evening, gentlemen. What can I do for you? Do you have any specific preferences or desires?" Holmes smirked. "Good evening, madam. We're here for a different reason. We're looking for my friend's murdered wife. She worked as a prostitute in London about 30 years ago." Holmes then turned to me. "Watson, would you be so kind as to show the lady a photograph of Caroline?" I pulled the oldest photo I had of Caroline from my coat pocket and showed it to the woman. But she just burst out laughing. "Gentlemen," she snorted, "do you seriously believe you'll find anyone who knows a whore who worked over 30 years ago?" The old lady was practically doubled over with laughter. A severe coughing fit finally stopped her. Holmes observed the old woman without so much as a twitch. At last, she composed herself and said, "Forgive me, but this is too funny. Do you know how many brothels and how many whores there are in all of London? It would take longer than your remaining lifetime to get through them all. And over 30 years ago, most of my girls weren't even born then." She began laughing again, revealing her rotten teeth as she did so. But Holmes countered dryly, "That's precisely why we're asking you and not your girls. You must have been well past your prime 30 years ago yourself." I could see from the old lady's face that she didn't quite understand what Holmes was implying, but she understood very well that it was certainly no compliment. "I can't do anything for you. Good day," she said, turning away and appearing slightly offended. I looked at Holmes and said, "I think we're done here." "Yes, I think so too," was Holmes's only comment on the matter. We returned to our waiting carriage. "Home, or would you rather continue?" I asked Holmes. "We won't give up that easily. We shall pay a visit to one more brothel. The madam in charge is a good acquaintance of mine, and she's rather well seasoned herself." "You have, if you'll pardon my saying so, madams of brothels amongst your close circle of friends?" Holmes smirked smugly. "That's a long story, my dear Watson, which I shall not discuss in detail here and now." I left it at that and kept my thoughts to myself while looking out of the window. A short while later we had arrived. The establishment bore the promising name Pleasure Grotto, and I must confess I was quite curious about Holmes's old acquaintance. We were introduced to a very well-groomed elderly lady whose pleasant appearance matched her elegant manner of speaking. When she recognised Holmes, her steps quickened, and she threw her arms around him warmly. "Sherlock, my dearest, what brings you to my house? How are you? We haven't seen each other for ages. Let me look at you, from head to toe, still the same handsome gentleman as before." If I didn't know Holmes so well, and if someone had told me about this, I wouldn't have believed it possible that my master detective, the emotionally reserved and slightly aloof Holmes, was standing there, blushing like a schoolboy. "Clarice," Holmes almost whispered, "it's a true delight. You look absolutely ravishing." Clarice extended her hand to Holmes, and Holmes, that unexpected old charmer, performed a perfectly executed old-fashioned hand kiss. I waited a while, and let them exchange further pleasantries before I cleared my throat audibly. Only now did Holmes seem to become aware of my obvious presence, and he immediately returned to being the composed investigator I knew him to be. "Clarice, would you mind taking a look at this photograph of my friend's wife? She was murdered and worked as a lady of the night about 30 years ago. Could you perhaps tell me anything about her?" I handed Clarice the photo of Caroline. She took it whilst gazing deeply into my eyes and expressed my deepest sympathies. I nodded appreciatively and waited for her reaction to the photograph. She studied it for quite a while, but then shook her head. "No, I'm sorry, Sherlock. I've never seen this girl before. But then again, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack." "You're certainly right, Clarice, but it was worth a try. Thank you for your time anyway, Mrs. Clarice. It has been an honour." I tipped my hat and turned to leave when I noticed that Holmes made no move to do the same. I looked at him expectantly, but my friend seemed somewhat embarrassed. Only then did the penny drop. "I'm sure you two have much to discuss. If you don't mind, Mr. Holmes, I'll take our carriage and head back to Baker Street." Yes, that's a good idea. I'll have a chat with Clarice about Caroline for a bit longer. Perhaps we might still come up with something." I bid farewell, took the waiting carriage and returned home, disappointed by our lack of success. Back at Baker Street, I poured myself another glass of brandy and sank into the armchair. My thoughts revolved around Holmes and his acquaintance Clarice, and of course, my Caroline. How could I have been so blind all these years? Why did I know nothing of her alleged past as a prostitute, and more importantly, about her child? How and why did she keep all of this from me? All those years we were married. I felt empty. I decided to go to bed, stare at the ceiling and wait for Holmes. I had to wait a very long time for Holmes. To be precise, a full 20 hours. It wasn't until 8 o'clock the following evening that Holmes returned. I examined my friend very carefully, but apart from the fact that he looked very tired and worn out, I couldn't detect any particular changes in him that might have indicated a night of passion with Clarice. Holmes sat down wearily with me in the living room, where I had spent several days leafing through various magazines. "You're late," I observed, and asked, "Did you have a tiring night?" Holmes ignored my allusion to Clarice and said, "Not an exhausting night, but rather a gruelling day." "Oh, really? And what have you and Clarice been up to all day?" Holmes ignored this obvious, ambiguous remark and said instead, "I spent all day at the city library, and I discovered some very interesting things. To be more precise, I know who murdered your wife." "Yes, we've got him. Who is it?" My heart leapt. But wait a moment. "Holmes, since when do you tell me such things without making a big mystery of the whole affair?" "I'm old, and I'm tired, and my knee hurts. What's more, I've lost my walking stick and can't remember where I left it." Holmes rose laboriously. "Right then, I'm off to bed." "But Holmes, do wait. Please tell me who it was," I called out, wanting to prevent him from going to bed. But I let it be. Anyone who knew Holmes understood that one way or another there was no chance of getting anything more out of him. So he hasn't changed after all. Once again, he's kept me in the dark. After spending a long time yesterday evening with our new landlady Alice and her husband Eddy, as sleep was once again out of the question, I found myself sitting awake early this morning, waiting for Holmes to finally rise from his bed. In my mind, I gave him another half hour before I would, admittedly not quite gentlemanly, evict him from his bed with a bucket of water. Just as I was playing this scenario through in my head, he appeared in my room, already fully dressed. "Watson, are you ready to catch a murderer?" "What a question, Holmes. I've been ready since last evening, when you had long since preferred your feather pillow," I answered sarcastically. "Well then, let's call for a carriage. I'll fill you in on the journey." And with that he was out the door, as if he were 20 years younger. As I already informed you, I was at the library yesterday conducting research. I examined old newspapers and combed through events from 4 years ago. In doing so, I came across a small article about a young woman who allegedly committed suicide. A few days later, I found the death notice of Susanna Blades. Susanna Blades was the daughter of our Mayor George Blades, who was newly elected to office in 1926. The initials GB, George Blades, I replied, having made the connection. That's right, and Susanna Blades must be little Susie, Holmes continued. Does that mean Caroline's daughter is dead? I'm afraid so, Watson, as much as I regret it, confirmed Holmes. So George Blades murdered Susie first, making it look like suicide, and then killed Caroline as well? Do you have any evidence for this? I asked Holmes. Not yet, Watson. All pure speculation based on circumstantial evidence. And where are we going now, if I may ask? I thought you wanted to catch a murderer. That's exactly what I intend to do. That's why we're going straight to George Blades to hear what he has to say. Holmes, you've had better plans, I said, somewhat disappointed. The Blades maid led us into the drawing room to wait for her employers. A few minutes later, George Blades appeared, followed by his smartly dressed wife. If I may introduce myself, my name is Sherlock Holmes. I'm a private investigator. This is my friend and advisor, Dr. Watson. Mr. Blades returned the handshake and said, A detective. How may I be of assistance, gentlemen? Holmes spoke again. We are investigating a private matter. Is it correct, sir, that your daughter took her own life? Yes, that's right. But what makes you bring this up? This tragedy happened more than 4 years ago. There is a connection, you see. The wife of my friend here, Holmes nodded at me and my pulse quickened, also took her own life over 4 years ago. However, this suicide has now been revealed to be cold-blooded murder. George Blades swallowed hard. I'm terribly sorry for you. What was your name again? Ah, yes, Watson, do forgive me. But for heaven's sake, what could the murder of your wife possibly have to do with my daughter's suicide? A great deal, Mr. Blades, replied Holmes. Dr. Watson's wife was your daughter's biological mother. George Blades, who had been casually leaning against the open fireplace, suddenly sought support. Caroline? Caroline is dead? I was seething inside. How deceitful could one be? My heart was pounding wildly, my pulse racing as fast as the thoughts in my head. The images of my dead Caroline surfaced, how she lay in her pool of blood with eyes wide open. She stared straight at me. The bullet hole stood out on her forehead. Everything inside me cramped up. I drew my revolver, leapt forward and aimed directly at Mr. Blades. He threw his hands up in fright. Holmes shouted at me, Watson, are you mad? Put the weapon down! I won't even consider it. Holmes, he took everything from me and Caroline too. He has 2 lives on his conscience. He doesn't deserve to be alive. George Blades began to stammer. I swear to God I didn't kill Caroline. I only just learned of her death through you. I loved her. I helped her through the worst time of her life. I know I caused her a lot of pain too. I wasn't man enough to stand up to my wife. Please don't kill me. Watson, I heard Holmes's voice. Mr. Blades is right. He did not kill Caroline. It was his wife, Mary Ann. His wife? But why? George Blades and I stared equally aghast at Holmes, then at Mary Ann, and back at Holmes again. The entire tragedy unfolded when you, Mr. Blades, failed to stand by your feelings and instead married Mary Ann for the sake of prestige. You were already a prominent figure in politics then and had the best chances of reaching the very top. But in your opinion, that was only possible with the right wife by your side. A former prostitute didn't fit that image. Mary Ann knew about Caroline, and she also knew about Susanna. I know from the letters that you cannot have children of your own, for whatever reason, which is why you wanted little Susanna. Whether you blackmailed your husband or simply made it clear that a small family would present a better social image, or perhaps it was the satisfaction of hurting your rival, I don't know. In any case, you convinced your husband to take Susanna away from her mother Caroline's loving care. Years passed until your husband was actually elected Mayor of London in 1926. I believe it was then that Susanna discovered you weren't her biological mother. You wanted to prevent a scandal, so Susanna, whom you never accepted as your child and in fact secretly hated, had to die. As long as you could continue your comfortable life as London's First Lady. But then Caroline suddenly reappeared. I assumed that, as a loving mother, she had always discreetly followed her daughter's development. When she learned of her death, she confronted you. Whether Caroline believed in her daughter's suicide or knew you were the perpetrator, I cannot say. What I can say is that things became too risky for you, and what worked so well the first time should work just as well the second time. You visited Caroline Watson at home and murdered her in cold blood. You must have still been in the house when Dr. Watson came home and found his wife dead, because at that point there was no murder weapon present. Only when Dr. Watson fainted did you place the weapon under Caroline's left hand and disappear. However, Caroline Watson was right-handed. She would never have shot herself with her left hand where the weapon was found. You, Mrs. Blades, are left-handed, which I observed carefully when you poured our teacups just now. That's why you automatically placed the weapon by the left hand. During Holmes's explanation, I inevitably turned my attention to Mary Ann Blades and released my focus from Mr. Blades. "You killed her," I shouted at her. "What kind of person are you? You've destroyed everything. You've killed 2 people." My finger rested tensely on the trigger. Mary Ann Blades was terrified. She whimpered something about, "I'm sorry," but I barely heard her. I was burning with rage, anger, grief, and pain. I heard Holmes somewhere far in the background. "Don't do it, Watson, for heaven's sake." Just a fraction more, and my revolver would fire, allowing me to taste the sweet satisfaction of revenge. I tensed my finger, and bang! Mary Ann Blades collapsed. A large bullet hole now gaped in her forehead as well. Shocked, I lowered my weapon. It took a moment for me to properly assess the situation. Mary Ann was dead. She had been killed by a shot to the head. But it wasn't my revolver that had fired the shot. To my right stood Mr. Blades, his still smoking gun raised. His face was as white as chalk, and he looked as if he might collapse at any moment. Nevertheless, he stammered, "She deserved it." Holmes glanced around the room and said dryly, "I truly wouldn't have expected this outcome to the story. Please call the police. I am a murderer." George Blades collapsed and began to weep. An incredible wave of sympathy for this man suddenly overcame me. He too had lost loved ones. Moreover, I myself had been about to commit murder, had Mr. Blades not beaten me to it. I looked at Holmes. "Do we really have to call the police?" Holmes snorted. "With all due respect to your compassion, but this man has just killed someone." "I nearly did the same," I replied. Holmes pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket, approached Mr. Blades, and took the weapon from his hand. Then he cleaned it with his cloth and placed the pistol in Mary Ann Blades's left hand. What worked the first and second time ought to work the third time as well. Then Holmes came over to me and put his arm around my shoulder. "Come along, Watson. Let's head home." You were listening to Charles Fraser, Time Which Heals No Wounds. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 6. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go audio production.